The Thomas Code, Chapter 2. 108 Sayings. The Gospel of Thomas uses the phrase Jesus said over 90 times, but the phrase does not primarily function to communicate the simple fact that the sayings are to be considered those of Jesus. That fact is established in the first sentence of the text, and surely one cannot presume the text's audience was staggeringly stupid as to require such constant reinforcement. Stephen Davies. Does the Gospel of Thomas have a meaning? I stumbled across the Thomas Code quite by chance. It all started in a coffee shop with the number 108. I was sitting reading Stephen Davies' classic book, The Gospel of Thomas and Christian Wisdom. At the end of the book was a paper called Does the Gospel of Thomas Have a Meaning?, which Davies had originally presented to an ESPO conference in 1994. The paper set out his theory that the Gospel of Thomas was used for divination. I had read the book before, but did not recall this paper. It was actually only attached to the second edition. I had, however, heard about the divination theory and did not like it. Thomas was a repository for mysteries, not a tool for fortune-telling. Does not the very introduction of the Gospel tell us that it contains the secret words of Jesus which must be understood to obtain eternal life? Yet I was intrigued by the paper because it asked a question that was tantalizingly simple. How many sayings were in the Gospel? This prompted the corollary. Could it be that the number of sayings was important? I had thought of Thomas as a fairly random collection without any real structure. But under the divination theory, the number of sayings had to be precise. Davies drew attention to the fact that most sayings included the words, Jesus said. What other purpose could this serve than to demarcate the sayings? But why should the sayings be separated one from another and not just merged together as we find in other sayings collections from the time? The implication was that there was some structure to Thomas that required individual sayings to be distinguished. Davies analyzed the number of sayings and came to the conclusion that the traditional count was wrong, and there were actually 108. This was the number which, under his divination hypothesis, could be selected by a roll of dice. His attempt at determining the number was intriguing, but some of his decisions were contrived. My count gave 112. But then what mattered was not how many sayings were in our surviving 4th century copy of the Gospel, but how many were in the original. Almost certainly some sayings had been added to the collection over the centuries. There was a suspicious clustering of duplicates near the end of the Gospel. So it was quite possible that the original had 108 sayings. Sitting in the coffee shop, I began to play with the number 108. The number seemed to have a lot of divisors. You could divide it by 2, 3, 4, 6, 9, 12, 18, and 36. This meant that you could group a collection of 108 sayings in many different ways. The number intrigued me. There was something special about it, but it took me a while to figure out what it was. Every number has what is called a prime factorization, a unique way in which it can be expressed as a group of prime numbers multiplied together. This will be explained further below. Please do not panic if you do not like mathematics. The mathematics here are very simple and will be set out in a way that I hope is easy to follow. When I reduced 108 to its prime factorization, I saw it was the first 2 prime factorization. I saw it was the first 2 primes raised to their own powers. 108 equals 2 squared dot 3 cubed. The number was actually unique. If you wanted to generate numbers from successive primes raised to their own powers, then only 108 could be used practically for a collection of sayings. It was a pleasant intellectual game to work out how the formula could be used to organize the Gospel. It would have to be structured as a multi-level hierarchy. This required the factors to be put in order, and I immediately saw there was one very attractive way of organizing 2 2s and 3 3s. It is this order of the factorization that I call the Thomas Code. Of course, this was nothing more than a game. It could not really be like this. There was no other early Christian text. Indeed, no other ancient text as far as I knew. That was organized in such a complex mathematical way. As I left the coffee shop and strolled around the town, certain sayings in Thomas went through my mind. These were sayings that had puzzled me for years, sayings which I had attempted to explain, some of which I thought I had explained. These sayings involved numbers. Now I suddenly saw that all my previous attempts and explanations were wrong. The sayings were talking about the very sequence I had just come across in the coffee shop. Moreover, the placing of one of these sayings, the 5 trees in paradise, was very significant. It came precisely at the end of the first important section, as predicted by the Thomas Code. Commentators had noticed that the gospel appeared to be signaling an end at this point, even though it had scarcely got going. But no one had known why. I went hurriedly home and sat down with a copy of the gospel and a pencil and marked out the pattern. There were some decisions to be made, but surprisingly few until the end section. Even from the start, there were some intriguing clues that I was on the right lines. Over the next few days, I puzzled out the main outlines of the structure set out in the second section of the book. Within a few weeks, I began to write this book and fill in the details. The link with the miracle of the loaves and fishes came much later and was a marvelous confirmation of the theory. But before we explain all this, we must go back to the beginning. The reader may be wondering why there should be any doubt about the number of sayings in Thomas, so we will start with Stephen Davy's theories. How many sayings? If you pick up any modern edition of the Gospel of Thomas, you will find a collection of sayings numbered from 1 to 114. Before the first saying there are a few lines of text, which scholars call the incipit, and at the end is the title, The Gospel of Thomas. The neat numbering of sayings, however, is a modern invention and not in the original. Ancient documents did not use numbering systems. Indeed, they did not even use any punctuation marks, nor did they have any blank spaces between words, but instead they ran all the letters together. In the Roman world, documents were produced by professional scribes and mostly read aloud by other scribes. The professional does not want to make things easy for the amateur. Before you could read a text, you would have to parse it, to decide where one word ended and the next began. Today, even the experts find it impossible to read an ancient work straight off like a modern text. In the original Thomas manuscripts, the sayings are all merged together in a continuous stream. So how can we tell one saying from another? In other early Christian texts, such as the Gospels, we must take our clues from the narrative. In Thomas we do not have a narrative, but we do have a unique feature found in no other text. Most sayings include the words Jesus said. Normally this is the start of the saying, although sometimes a disciple or some other person makes a statement or asks a question, followed by a Jesus said reply. It would be nice and neat if every saying included a Jesus said, but nothing is ever that easy in Thomas. Instead of Jesus said, some sayings have he said, although it is clear that it is Jesus who is speaking. Things get harder when the subject matter changes completely without a Jesus said or he said to indicate a new saying. In these cases, do we have 2 sayings or 1? The first editors of the Coptic Thomas made decisions to divide the Gospel up into the individual sayings, which they then numbered 1 to 114. Later scholars disputed some of these decisions. No 2 scholars ever agree on anything. Some scholars go further and divide up the individual sayings into component parts. So, for example, you will come across sayings referred to as 33a, 33b, and so on. However, to split sayings up in this way goes against the grain of those Jesus said statements. The Jesus said statements stop us from reading the Gospel of Thomas as one continuous whole as we would the letters of Paul or the 4 Gospels. They bring us up short and force us to think more about each saying before going on to the next. The 2nd century Gospel of Philip, which was bound immediately after Thomas in Nag Hammadi Codex, i.e., is also a sayings gospel, but has no such individual saying marker. So we tend to read it differently from Thomas. as more of a continuous document. Other Jewish saying sources, such as Proverbs or the Wisdom of Solomon, are similar to Philip in this respect. The Jesus said statements impose a structure on Thomas which is not found in these other texts, and this structure must have had some significance to the early users of the Gospel. Does the Gospel of Thomas have a meaning? Stephen Davies asks why the Jesus said statements should be so monotonously repeated. See the quotation at the head of this chapter. Davies suggested that the reason it was necessary to distinguish one saying from another was that the Gospel was used for divination. Although Davies has made major contributions to the study of Thomas, he has always modestly admitted that he does not understand the Gospel. However, there were other ancient documents equally enigmatic. The Chinese I Ching is also divided into a large number of mystifying sayings. The seeker would approach the I Ching as an oracle to ask a question. They would throw sticks into the air, and from the pattern the sticks made on the ground, a saying would be selected. The seeker would then have to ponder the meaning of the saying to understand the answer that the universe had revealed. The I Ching came from a different culture. But a similar example from the Roman world was the Oracle of Homer. This consisted of 216 sayings selected from the writings of Homer. These sayings, stripped as they were of their original context, were equally mystifying. To consult the oracle, you would throw 3 dice. There are 216 combinations from such a throw, so the result would point to a single saying from the collection that gave the seeker a suitably ambiguous answer to their question. What Davies noticed was the number of sayings in Thomas was very close to 108, which is half of 216. If the Gospel originally contained 108 sayings, 3 throws of the dice could easily have been used to select a unique saying from Thomas. All that would be required was one small change. If one of the dice read 4, 5, 6, then this throw could be repeated, or perhaps replaced by 1, 2, 3. There would then be 108 different combinations, enabling 108 different combinations, enabling one saying from Thomas to be selected. So, did Thomas function as a type of Christian I Ching? It was necessary to determine the exact number of sayings to support this hypothesis. Davies was proposing that the Gospel had been used continuously for divination up to and including the complete Coptic version that has come down to us. This meant that the number of sayings had to remain constant as the Gospel was transmitted and translated. The Jesus said, and he said dividers would play a vital role in enabling the selection of the correct individual saying. But were there 108 sayings? By keeping more rigorously to the Jesus said, and he said statements, Davies concluded that some sayings had been incorrectly split by the first editors. By counting these as one saying, he was able to get to exactly 108 sayings. However, he had to make some subjective judgment calls and admitted that other scholars would probably come to a different answer. Davies did not really offer any evidence for his divination theory other than the number of sayings. And because of the doubt as to how many sayings the Gospel originally contained, the case he made was quite weak. There were some obvious objections. If the copy of the Gospel that had come down to us had been used actively for divination with dice, would there not be some marks on the manuscript to make this easier? It would have been a cumbersome process to count through all the sayings to find the correct one. And why would Thomas have been bound as part of a book containing many other texts that were certainly not used for divination? This would be awkward because a divination tool would need to be regularly consulted. In any case, unlike 216, the number 108 is not that special for a method of selecting from dice throws. Any multiple of 36 would do as well. For example, if there were 72 sayings, then on the third dice odd numbers could be interpreted as 1, with even numbers being 2. Or if there were 144 sayings, then one dice could be thrown again if it read 5 or 6. The divination theory did not command much support. Personally, I subscribed to the standard theory that the sayings would originally have been transmitted orally. At some point they were written down, but the order of the sayings was probably unimportant. Indeed, the lack of order was one reason why some scholars considered Thomas to be early. They regarded it as a haphazard collection of sayings, some potentially going back to Jesus with others added later. Its scholarly value was as a collection of sayings that were potentially independent of the other Gospels. My view of an oral Thomas began to crumble as I worked on my book, The Rock and the Tower. In the final stages of editing that book, I realized that the Gospel of John's account of the Last Supper was based on the Gospel of Thomas. Eventually, I detected no less than 20 sayings in Thomas that had been used by the author of John in this one section of his Gospel. Sometimes the use of a saying was quite loose. Other times it was very specific. But it was significant that the 20 sayings were not randomly scattered over Thomas. Most came from a small section of Thomas, and the sayings in this section were used in almost the same order in John as they appear in our Coptic Thomas. This meant that a written Gospel of Thomas that looked very similar to our Coptic copy, except that it would have been in Greek, must have been in existence and well accepted by the time the Gospel of John was written at around 100 NA. My work on John also gave me a new respect for the Coptic version of Thomas, which seemed to be closer to the copy that the author of John possessed than the Greek fragments. While writing The Rock and the Tower, I had stopped reading what others had written on Thomas. I wanted to spend my time on the original sources and not be swayed by other interpreters, but this changed as I was finishing the book. I began to catch up on my reading, and I turned again to Davies's book, and so started my fascination with 108. Prime factors. Most people are aware of prime numbers. These are defined as numbers that cannot be divided by any number other than itself and 1. For example, the number 11 is prime because there is no number 11 is prime because there is no number other than 11 or 1 that can divide it without leaving a remainder. However, the number 10 is not prime because it is equal to 2 times 5, which I will write as 2.5 using a dot for multiplication. Prime numbers form the foundation of number theory. In the 1st century, the importance of prime numbers was already well established. The most famous work of ancient mathematicians was Euclid's Elements, which dates from c. 300 BC. It contains 2 important proofs concerning prime numbers. One is that there are an infinite number of primes. The other, now called the fundamental theory of arithmetic or the unique prime factorization theorem, states that every integer, whole number, greater than 1 is either a prime or can be written as a unique product of primes. So, for example, the number 120 has the prime factorization of 2.2.2.3.5. The order of the factors is not important, but if you try and reduce 120 to prime numbers, you will always end up with the same 5 factors. To date, an enormous number of prime numbers has been discovered, mostly by computer. But the sequence of prime numbers starts simply enough. 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, 13, 17, 19, 23. The number 108 has a very special prime factorization involving the first 2 primes, 2 and 3. The prime factorization has 2 2s and 3 3s and 3 3s. Or using modern notation, 108 2.2.3.3.3. 108 equals 2 squared dot 3 cubed. So, it is equal to the first 2 primes raised to their own powers. How special is this? Well, it is one of a sequence of numbers that starts with these 4. 2 squared equals 4. 2 squared dot 3 cubed equals 108. 2 squared dot 3 cubed dot 5 to the power of 5 equals 337,500. 2 squared dot 3 cubed dot 5 to the power of 5 dot 7 to the power of 7 equals 277,945,762,500. After this, the numbers get huge. No one would get very far with just 4 sayings, so the only practical number in this sequence for a collection of sayings is 108. In this sense, we can say that 108 is unique, but why should the compilers of Thomas select the number of sayings based on mathematics? People would not normally associate any connection between mathematics and Christianity, but we will see that the connections are there. The reason is that to the ancients, these mathematical discoveries had religious significance. Unlike modern mathematicians, the ancients attached mystical meanings to numbers and mathematical properties. This goes right back to the first Greek mathematician, Pythagoras. He kept his mathematical discoveries secret as mysteries to be taught only to those who joined his religious cult, the Pythagoreans. At its origins, mathematics was indistinguishable from mysticism. The Greeks had a myriad of gods led by Zeus, but as their pantheon arose by a process of accretion of many local deities, it lacked logical cohesion. Indeed, the Greek origin myths for the universe are quite vague. In the most prominent version, the first of the gods was Gaia, the earth, who emerged from primordial chaos. But what is certain is that Zeus was seen as a relative latecomer, the supposed child of the Titan Cronus, son of Gaia. Zeus might rule the world, but he had not created it. Now imagine what would happen when a culture holding to these beliefs began to uncover mathematical truths that seemed more fundamental than anything in the visible world. Surely it was not Zeus who created the idea of a right-angled triangle or the precise mathematical relationship between the lengths of its sides. Such mathematical properties must have come before anything visible, before even Gaia. But if mathematical truth was not created by Zeus or the other gods, then humans were beginning to penetrate to a level of knowledge beyond the gods themselves. There is a vital difference between the Jewish God and Zeus, in that Yu, unlike Zeus, was believed to have created the universe. The early Jesus movement did not share the Jewish mainstream's view of the Yu as revealed in the Jewish scriptures, but they did believe in an ultimate God, Yo, the Father. The world, however, was not under the direct control of this ultimate God, because his divine nature meant that he was too remote to communicate directly with humans. Instead, the world was ruled by lesser divine beings, angels who had rebelled against you. These angels had introduced evil into the creation. The Jesus movement believed that Jesus was the Son of God the Father, a part of the ultimate God who had been sent to assume human nature and redeem humanity from the evil rule of these angels. The importance of mathematics was that it must have been created before the creation of the visible world. Mathematics could not be created after physical things, since such objects can only exist in a physical space which is ruled by the laws of mathematics. But if mathematics came before physical things, then it must have been created by the ultimate God, the Father, before he created the physical universe, and even before he created the angels, the sons of God. So mathematics was uncorrupted by these lesser entities, a rare glimpse into the mind of the ultimate God himself. From this came the belief that God the Father would have somehow encoded some of the secrets of his plan for mankind and the universe in mathematical form. This, I think, is why the early Jesus movement searched for religious meaning in mathematics, a meaning which they found and expressed in the Thomas Code. If so, it comes from a collision of Jewish and Greek culture, and so probably does not go back to the very first stage of the Jesus movement in Judea in the 20s and 30s AD. Instead, we can see the mathematical ideas as being formed in the 40s and 50s, when the expanding Jesus movement was coming into contact with Greek ways of thinking. The prime numbers then were all part of God's secret plan. So we should not be surprised to find out that 108 was special because the Jesus movement attached a special religious meaning to the first primes, the Thomas Code. The order of the prime factorization is not important in modern mathematics, but if the numbers had some special significance, then the order would have been very important. How can we express 2 2s and 3 3s in an order that would have intuitive appeal to the ancient mind. There is one pattern that immediately stood out to me, and it is this I have called the Thomas Code. 3.2.3.2.3. The reason for choosing this order was simple. Aesthetics. It seemed more special than other orderings, but we can analyze the features of the aesthetic attraction below. Symmetry. The most important property is that the ordering is symmetrical around the central three. The sequence is the same whether read in reverse or forward. Symmetry was of vital importance to the ancients, and they loved symmetrical patterns. They even composed whole passages of text in asymmetrical structure, called a chiastic composition. It is well known that the early Christians were fascinated by chiastic structures. They are particularly important in the first narrative gospel to be written, that of Mark, where scholars have discovered a number of chiastic passages. The requirement for symmetry eliminates all but one other ordering of the 5 factors. The sequence 2.3.3.3.2 is also symmetrical, but the sequence above seems to me to be far preferable. Twin twos. 3.2.3.2.3. The pattern has the 2 twos encased by 3s. The 2s are placed as twins on either side of the central 3. 2 is, of course, the number of twinship, and Thomas is not a real name but means twin. We will explore this further once we have seen the significance of the 2s. 3 3s. The 3s form a triad pattern. 3.2.3.2.3, occupying both the center and the 2 ends, being the first and the last. The placing of the 3s means that the pattern has both 2-fold symmetry with the 2s and a 3-fold symmetry with the 3s. I think it is this combination of both a 2-fold and 3-fold nature which makes the pattern so attractive. We will see later what the 2s and 3s represent. The first 3 prime. We have seen how the number 108 is generated by the first 2 primes raised to their own powers. The numbers 2 and 3 are also special because they are the only 2 consecutive numbers that are both prime, and there is another feature that would have appealed to the mystical mathematicians who created Thomas. The Thomas Code is not just created from the first 2 primes, but is intimately related to the 3rd prime, the number 5. There is, in fact, a unique relationship between the first 3 primes because the 3rd is the sum of the first 2. This also means that 5 equals 2 plus 3. 3 equals 5 minus 2. These 2 relations occupy a key role in the mathematical symbolism of the early Jesus movement. In a mathematical sense, both properties are unique. If we add any 2 successive primes, there is only one case in which we get another prime, and that is 2 and 3, which sum to the next prime 5. There are an infinite number of prime pairs where the difference between the 2 primes is 2. For example, 5 and 7, 11 and 13, 17 and 19. But there is only one pair of primes where the difference is 3, and that pair is 2 and 5. A modern mathematician would see these unique properties as deriving from the fact that 2 is the only even prime. However, to the religious mathematicians of the early Jesus movement, the Ultimate Father created these relationships to express a spiritual truth. So the 3 prime numbers 2, 3, and 5 were intimately linked together to signify a secret not known to the angelic powers who ruled the world. The Thomas Code was an expression of this relationship because although it was made up from 2 and 3, it gave the total 5 in 3 different ways. There are 5 factors in the Thomas Code. If we add the 2 prime numbers that feature in the factorization, we get 5. If we add any 2 consecutive factors, we also get 5. The first 2 are consequences of the prime factorization of 108. The last point, though, is only true for our particular sequence. In fact, this is the only way in which the factors can be organized so that if we add up any consecutive pair of numbers, we get the same answer. For example, if we were to take the other symmetrical sequence 2.3.3.3.3.2, then the first pair adds to 5, but the second pair adds to 6. The Thomas hierarchy. If the Thomas Code was used to structure the 108 sayings, then the Gospel must be structured as a hierarchy. This would be unique among Christian texts, or indeed among any other text from the ancient world. It is much more familiar in our modern information age because it is the natural way in which computers organize collections. Electronic computers work in binary structure, which is equivalent to a prime factorization involving twos, such as 2.2.2.2.2.2.2.2.2.2.2.2.2.2 equals 256. If Thomas is organized using a similar structure, albeit involving twos and threes, then it has anticipated the development of computers by almost 2,000 years. Hierarchies may not have been used for texts, but they were very familiar in the ancient world as the way to organize people, and in particular, armies of soldiers. Suppose we had an army of 108 men and wanted to organize it using the Thomas Code. We would do it in this way. The first factor is 3. So we would start by grouping our soldiers into threes. Let us call each of these groups a squad. The next factor is 2. So we would take each pair of squads and combine them to make a platoon. Each of these platoons would have 6 soldiers. The following factor is 3 again, and we would then group our platoons into threes. Let us call such a group a regiment. Each of our regiments would have 18 soldiers. The next to last factor is 2. So we must double our regiments up to make divisions consisting of 2 regiments, or 36 soldiers. The last factor is 3. Our 3 divisions would make up our army, giving a total of 108 soldiers. So each soldier belongs to a squad, a platoon, a regiment, and a division. Instead of 108 soldiers, we have 108 sayings, but the principle of the ordering is the same. There are 2 consequences of applying the Thomas Code to the sayings in this way. The ordering is multi-level. Each saying belongs to a group of 3, 6, 18, and 36 sayings, as well as the whole Gospel of 108 and being an individual. Moreover, the smaller groups relate to the larger groups. Those smaller groups relate to the larger groups. So, for example, we can analyze an 18 into 6 threes. This gives a much more complex structure than simply dividing the Gospel into sections. It explains why previous attempts to find a structure have not been successful, although there have been many hints that such a structure exists. The ordering is symmetrical. We can either start with the individual sayings and amalgamate them into groups, or we can start with the whole and divide it up. Either way, we apply the same factors in the same order of 3, 2, 3, 2, 3. This is a consequence of the symmetrical nature of the Thomas sequence. Perhaps the best way to show the symmetrical nature of the hierarchy is to set out the different levels. 108 groups of 1 saying, 36 groups of 3 sayings, 18 groups of 6 sayings, 6 groups of 18 sayings, 3 groups of 36 sayings, 1 group of 108 saying. At the end of this book, I have included a copy of the full Gospel renumbered and organized using this structure. In theory, no level of the hierarchy is any more important than any other. To reflect this, we could number each saying by its position in each level, the hierarchy. This would give us numbers such as 1.1.3.2, 0.3.3. In this example, the saying would be in the first 36, the first 18 of that 36, the third 6 of the 18, the second 3 of the 6, and the third saying of the 3. Such a numbering system would be correct but almost incomprehensible. However, in practice, it is difficult to develop a multi-level hierarchy without anchoring it at one level. So we will find that the creators of Thomas attached particular importance to the 6 groups of 18. To reflect this, I have adopted a numbering system based upon the 18s. The first number is the 18, 1 to 6, and the second, the position of the saying within the 18. So instead of numbering the example as 1.1.3.2.3, it now becomes 1.18, meaning that it is the last saying of the first 18. The use of the 18s is convenient, but the reader should remember that the hierarchy is more complex than just 18s. The full structure in the different levels, but organized primarily by 18s, is illustrated by the diagram. So far, we have not offered any proof that the Thomas Code is the structure behind the Gospel. It is not even certain that the Gospel had 108 sayings. All we can say is that 108 is in a credible range for the original number of sayings. So it is now time to look at how the Gospel itself tells us it is encoded using the Thomas Code. And we will start with that saying 1.18.